Congratulations on the regime. It is a wild ride.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's wild to watch. And I wonder, would you talk a little bit about your initial impressions when reading Senator Holt on the page?
Well, first of all, I had never read any a script like it. It was completely original and very initially confusing. It was I didn't at first understand the tone
Mm-hmm.
of the show because it's so smart. I mean, Will Tracy is a terrific writer, and uh, it was so smart, and I didn't really know where it was going. You know what I mean? Um, but I really loved the writing, and I really thought it was very smart and clever, and uh, intriguing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's also has this built-in absurdity. And
Mm,
would you talk a bit about playing into that? I mean, Senator Holt's pretty much a straight character, but is surrounded
hmm.
by absurdity. Just even that scene at the table, which
Yeah,
reminded me of the dinner scene in Citizen Kane, where the table just getting
right.
keeps bigger. But so much absurdity built in. And would you talk about playing, opposite that really, or you're immersed in it?
Well, the funny thing is that you're not thinking of it, the absurdity of it when you're there.
Yeah.
Um, uh, it's just twisted enough
Mhm.
without going so overboard that you're like, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. It's disorienting.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's, sort of my character is sort of there in a way. I mean, among other things, to kind of um, to let the audience know that they're not in Kansas anymore. You know,
Right. Right.
this is Oz, and it's a very oh, and speaking of which, the poster behind you. Yeah. Um, um, it's a very this is a whole other world. Um, you know, um, so yeah, it's disorienting, and it's uh it's a little bit like when the mushrooms hit, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Things start kind of warping, and things get a little bent out of shape, and you're like, where you don't quite know, you can't quite find your footing.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's, I think, sort of the purpose or the of those scenes, or that scene. Why is this guy looming over me?
Mhm.
You know, walking through a literal hall of mirrors.
Yeah, and I want to touch on gender a little bit. I think it's, something we don't get to see very often. We have these two women in power
Mm-hmm.
facing off, or, in this tense conversation. Would you talk a little bit about that kind of flip? Because typically it would be two men.
Well, I think it's interesting. They're two um, political figures,
Mm.
but they're very, very different kinds of figures. One is, coming from an ostensible democracy, as imperfect as it is, and is there, working at the behest of her leader, of her boss. The other is a sort of charismatic, almost cult-like figure who leads through personality and ideology and personal imperative rather than strategic imperatives. Um, and so, while it's true that it's not common to see women in these kinds of roles, I think that the fact that they're women is almost secondary to the dynamic that's being explored between um, these two different systems,
Hmm.
ways of operating. Um, and I think uh, the fact that Elena is a woman is fascinating and a lot more sort of unusual um, and interesting because normally if we were living in the normal cliched story, a woman leader would be benevolent and you know liberal minded and progressive, and she would abortion would be legal, and the, no child would be hungry, and there'd be no more war. This is the fantasy anyway.
Right.
um and I
Yeah.
think this story has nothing to do with that.
Right. Not
It's
at all.
just, it's not in that world, it's not in that kind of cliched idealized. this
Right.
this is a this is a this is a completely different reality,
Yeah.
if that
Um,
makes any sense.
yeah, no, absolutely. And you have this great scene, of course, with Kate Winslet, who's at the center of this series. Would you talk a little bit about, because there's this incredible exchange of power that is happening, and it's nuanced. And would you talk about shooting those scenes with Kate Winslet?
I think she's just phenomenal. I'd work with her again in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
She's a very funny person,
Mm.
and she just really knows her stuff, and she's a total pro.
Mhm.
And that scene at the table was the first scene we shot. It was the first scene of the series that we first day of filming, period.
Oh, wow.
So it was really it was intense and nerve wracking. You know what I mean? It's everybody's a little bit on edge on the first day.
Yeah.
Uh, but she's just terrific. And she's an excellent producer. She's great at just putting people at ease and knowing what's happening, and knowing her stuff, and having a very light but confident touch. And I love that about her.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. And
Thank
something
you.
that you know, I live in the US. I
Mhm.
we've been subject to a populist leader who is a hypocrite and a buffoon, but also incredibly dangerous. And I
Mhm.
think that something like the regime or storytelling has this power to tell a truth possibly even deeper than the actual facts. And I wonder if you would talk about
Mhm.
being a part of that, a project like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that uh storytelling is absolutely necessary to human development,
Yes.
and and to a culture that you know uh, a culture that doesn't listen to stories or doesn't share stories, or that limits the stories that can be told or shared, um, is bankrupt, and loses its soul, right? So it's really, uh, I feel very strongly that through telling stories, hopefully, we come to some sort of, I don't know, some certain stories can be elucidating in a way that maybe, as you say, hitting us over the head with the news isn't. I think our news media in the United States is really failing miserably at its job, and so that leaves a big gigantic hole. And I think that's the hole that artists are there to fill, I think.